Chapter 5. 2 days later, at midnight, a stretch limousine glided effortlessly up the hill to the professor's door. The powerful electric engine pulled the limo along effortlessly and almost silently. The car pulled up, and Nathan took a deep breath while wiping his sweaty hands on his trousers. "Well, time to rock and roll," he said. He opened the car door and got out. The front door of the professor's house opened. Nathan stood to the side, holding the car door open. Elizabeth glided out of the professor's house and towards the car. "What do you think?" said Elizabeth as she reached Nathan. "I do what?" said Nathan, stammering unintelligibly. "I'll take that as you like it," said Elizabeth with a small smile. She had just a touch of makeup on and had let her hair flow straight down her back. She was wearing a silvery blue dress which was strapless and hugging her upper body tightly, before it flowed out slightly at her waist until it reached the floor. Despite that, it still gave the impression of a form-fitting slim cocktail dress that hinted at much but was modest and revealed nothing. She got into the limousine, and Nathan got in behind her when he came back to his senses. They closed the limousine door and the car drove off as the professor stood outside his front door and whispered "good luck" quietly into the night. They travelled in silence until they arrived. The limousine pulled up and the door opened automatically. A robotic voice then said, "We have reached your destination. Have a good day," as the pair of them got out of the limousine. Nathan got out first and held his hand out for Elizabeth to help her get out of the car. As they did, they had a look around, noticing several other limousines and high-end cars. They were greeted by an older man in a suit. "Good evening, sir and madam. Are you here for the fundraiser?" "Yes, sir, we are," said Elizabeth. "Wonderful. Would sir and madam like to join the queue over there?" said the suited man, sweeping his arm in the direction they needed to go in. "Thank you, sir," said Elizabeth and Nathan together. Nathan then held his arm out, and she linked hers around his, and they walked off in the direction indicated. They joined the queue, and after a few moments Nathan said, "I know this queue is moving relatively quickly, but have you noticed some people are just walking through?" "Yes, I did notice. I think they're the VIPs, said Elizabeth. "I thought we were VIPs, said Nathan. "Oh no, we're just invitees," said Elizabeth with a hint of sarcasm. "I didn't even realize there was a difference with these sorts of things," said Nathan. "I'm surprised you didn't know. I thought you came from money," said Elizabeth. "I do, but I try to stay as far away from the family as possible. To be honest, they're mostly just a pain in the arse. Anyway, I'm what you would call new money. This looks like old money and the aristocracy to me. So, from that point of view, then yes, I do know the stratification. I suppose you would call it of the upper class," said Nathan. "It's weird. You've got the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. If you want to, I think in those outdated forms. However, you've also got layers within each of those classes," said Elizabeth. "Yeah, you're not joking," said Nathan sarcastically. "Anyway, have you got the tickets? We're coming up to the entrance." No. "Yes, here's yours," said Elizabeth, handing him his ticket and getting her own out of her bag. As she did, Elizabeth noticed someone ahead of her in the queue. "Do you know who that is?" she said, raising her hand to point. "Yes, stop," said Nathan, whispering and grabbing her hand before she could raise it too far. "There are going to be some noteworthy people here of one type or another," said Nathan. "Yes, but that's," said Elizabeth, trailing off slowly before then continuing. "I suppose I didn't really internalize it very well." "Not if you're going to react like that you didn't. There are going to be lots of really famous people here that we need to talk to. Isn't that the whole point of us being here? We need to drum up support for our cause, as well as funding," said Nathan exasperatedly. "Yes, you're right. It's just when you know you need to do something on an intellectual level, but then there is actually being here and doing it. And it's something very different," said Elizabeth, taking a deep breath and shaking her head. Elizabeth and Nathan were next in line to the entrance, and in front of them were 2 security guards. They looked for all the world to be 6'6" tall and very, very big. "Please, could I have Sir and Madam's invitations?" said one of them. Nathan passed his over first, and the security guard waved a scanner device over the invitation. The device flashed yellow repeatedly, which seemed to make Nathan nervous, but before he could say or do anything, it flashed green. The guard continued looking at the screen of the device and then looked at Nathan's face repeatedly. He then thumbed something on the screen. "Sir may enter," he said. Nathan walked through and stood over to one side, while the process was repeated with Elizabeth. Once she joined him, they both entered and followed the last group down a corridor lined with paintings that looked like they should have been in a museum. The group in front of them moved to one side and passed through the next door, revealing the current Prime Minister. They knew as a party fundraiser it would have some very high-ranking people within the political party at this event, but they hadn't for one moment expected the Prime Minister to be there. The pair of them walked up to him in something resembling shock. "Good evening, Dr. Elizabeth Reacher and Mr. Nathan Watts. It's a pleasure to have both of you here with us this evening," said the Prime Minister. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Prime Minister. Truthfully, though, we weren't expecting you to be here this evening," said Elizabeth. "I'm sure you understand the security, especially with the bombings recently," said the Prime Minister. "Yes, of course, Prime Minister. Well, it is still a pleasure to see you here," said Elizabeth. "It's a pleasure to see you two here as well, and I look forward to your presentation," said the Prime Minister. "I'm looking forward to it myself," said Elizabeth weakly after pausing for a few moments. Nathan glanced towards her before giving an elaborate bow, while Elizabeth curtsied very precisely. The pair of them gave a very precise about-face. Then in lockstep, they walked through the double doors into the hall. Despite the room being quite crowded, the pair made a beeline for the bar. "What may I get, sir and madam?" said the barman. "I'll have whiskey on the rocks, and you?" said Nathan, turning to Elizabeth. "I'll have a white wine spritzer," said Elizabeth. After a few moments, the barman came back with the drinks, and the pair took them and had a long, deep drink. "That was the sodding Prime Minister," said Elizabeth. "Well, we did want high profile," said Nathan. "But the Prime Minister," said Elizabeth. "What do you think the Prime Minister meant with that comment about the presentation?" said Nathan. "I'm not sure," said Elizabeth, getting the invitation out of her handbag. "It says on the invitation that selected individuals will be making presentations, but it doesn't say anything about us." "I think we'd better come up with a plan B, just in case we're called upon to do this presentation," said Nathan. "I agree," said Elizabeth. Nathan nodded before having another large gulp of his whiskey. "Putting that aside for now, aren't we here to drum up support for our cause? How do you want to go about doing that?" said Nathan. "You're the one who's got more experience in this sort of arena. What would you recommend?" said Elizabeth. "I suggest we walk around to see who's here and then talk to any targets of opportunity that come up," said Nathan. "Okay. Shall we then?" said Elizabeth, taking his arm in hers. She walked off and dragged him with her before he managed to get his feet back under him. Before they had taken more than a few steps, a fit-looking elderly man blocked their way. "Please excuse me," said the old man with a slow Southern States twang to his voice. "Would you mind if I had a word?" "I hope you don't mind, but who are you?" said Elizabeth, warily raising a frosty eyebrow. "Please excuse my lack of manners. I am Michael Davenport of Davenport Industries," said the silver-haired American industrialist. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. How can we help you?" said Elizabeth even more warily than before. "Would you mind if we went somewhere more private? There are a few rooms over here for more exclusive conversations," said Michael, gesturing to some doors along one side of the hall. "Okay, you lead. We'll follow," said Elizabeth. He walked spryly to one of the doors that had a vacant sign on the outside and opened it for the other two, gesturing them inside. He followed them into the room, closing the door firmly behind him, and sat down at a small table in the room and put a device onto the table in front of him, switching it on. Elizabeth's and Jacob's ears popped, and they heard a weird buzzing sound. "Please excuse me, my young friends. I don't wish anyone to overhear our conversation. This device here should block or scramble anyone trying to overhear our chat," said Michael, gesturing to the device and then to two other chairs. "Oh, please sit down." Elizabeth and Nathan followed his gesture, and sat opposite him at the table. "My young friends, a little birdie told me that you may be able to help me with something," said Michael. "I'm not sure how we can help you, sir, but I think there may be a chance we may be able to help each other. While we weren't expecting you specifically, no offence, we were looking for someone like you," said Elizabeth. "No offence taken. Let us talk things out anyway and we'll see if we can help each other," said Michael, "as I'm sure you both know who I am." "Yes, your company has branched out into many different areas, but predominantly aerospace, robotics, and engineering in general," said Nathan. "You're right for the most part, although we have many other ongoing concerns," said Michael. "But the main one we don't have at the moment is space. Oh, we do have some satellites and satellite launching facilities, as well as being one of the companies involved in funding the International Space Station these days, but we don't have anything else, really. To be fair, neither does anyone else, with the exception of the space agencies, and even they're just unmanned probes spread out across the solar system," said Elizabeth. "Too true, my young friend, but we think we should be doing much, much more in space. Me and the people I represent were very impressed when you British launched your spaceplane, and then very disappointed and outraged over the bombings and the cancellation of any more orders of them," said Michael. "A little birdie tells me that you're just as upset with the chain of events so far, and more than that, you want to use the spaceplanes to get back to the moon." "Who is this little birdie that has told you these things?" said Elizabeth warily. "I'd really rather not give up my sources, but can I have confirmation of that information?" said Michael. "Yes, we do want to go back to the moon, and our plans do involve the spaceplane," said Elizabeth. "Good, good. I'm very glad to hear that, because me and the people I represent want to be part of that," said Michael. "Wonderful. I'm very glad to hear that, but how do you think we can help each other?" said Elizabeth very warily. She was trying to keep the hope out of her voice, as there were many ways a company like his could help them. "This little birdie has told me that you need resources, and, well, not to put too fine a point on it, I have resources," said Michael, leaning forward and placing his elbows on the table and placing his fingertips against each other, pointing up and resting his chin on them. "But there is a catch." "There's always a catch. What is it?" said Nathan. "You're right, my young friend. There is always a catch," said Michael. "In this case, me and the people I represent have enemies, both political and economic, which is the reason for this meeting and the security." Michael gestured towards the device on the table. "I can't help you directly, but I can help you through subsidiaries and companies that my friends and partners own. However, I do want to have a part of this myself, so what I'm going to do is set up a subsidiary company that I will loan to you through several shell companies. All strictly legal," said Michael, noticing the frown developing on Elizabeth's face. "I know I can help you with funding, but what else can I do to help?" said Michael. "Thank you, and we appreciate your offer. But what else do you want for this assistance?" said Elizabeth. "I'll help you with funding and any other resources within my power to give, but I want this subsidiary company to have part ownership in your company," said Michael carefully. Elizabeth and Nathan looked at each other, and then Elizabeth said, "What sort of ownership in the company were you looking at?" "Nothing too excessive, just about 45%. That still leaves you with a controlling majority," said Michael. "How about 5%? said Nathan. "That's a bit too small for my taste. How does 35% sound to you?" said Michael. 15% sounds better to me, said Nathan, smiling. "Okay, my young friend. You have a deal. 15% it is," said Michael, smiling back at the other two as well. "Wait. Before this deal is concluded, what do we get for this 15% ownership we're giving you?" said Elizabeth. "I said funding and whatever other resources I have to offer," said Michael. "But what does that funding and resources extend to?" said Elizabeth. "Okay, right. It can't be too excessive, admittedly," said Michael, sighing. "I can still give you a lot." "Please stop lawyering. I would like to know exact numbers instead of just excessive or a lot," said Elizabeth. Nathan glanced at Elizabeth, but kept his peace. Michael stared at Elizabeth for a few moments before then saying, "There are some restrictions on how much I can give you. It isn't just because of my enemies, but also because of my resources as well." He held a hand up to stop Elizabeth as she began to speak. He then continued, saying, "Yes, I know those resources are formidable given the companies I own and I am involved with. I should be able to give you several hundred million, almost straight away. I should also be able to give you as much as 2 billion over the next 2 to 3 years. I will also consider an emergency fund for another billion, if I deem it necessary." Michael held his silver-tipped cane near the top and pointed it at them, ending on a stern note. Elizabeth just sat back in her chair in shock. Michael looked at both of them carefully, frowning slightly before he then sat back in his chair and chuckled to himself. "You weren't expecting that, were you?" "No, not really," said Nathan haltingly. "Well, get a hold of yourself because there's more than just financial aid I can give you," said Michael. "I can also give you technological aid, given I own several engineering companies. Here is a card with contact details of someone you can get in contact with for that kind of aid," said Michael, passing over a business card. Elizabeth picked up the card. "Are you being serious? Isn't a physical business card a bit archaic these days?" "Yes, I suppose, but passing you the data this way means it can't be picked up by any snooping devices looking for electronic signals," said Michael. "Is that not just a bit paranoid?" said Elizabeth. "Maybe, but I need to be paranoid. My enemies mustn't know what has been said at this meeting and that I'm helping. At least, not as much as I actually am, because as much as we try to keep this quiet, something will definitely come out. If nothing else, several people saw us walk into this room," said Michael. "I suppose you have a point, and we thank you for all this assistance you're giving us," said Elizabeth. "Don't thank me. After all, I am getting something out of it," said Michael. "Yes, but is that all you want? Part ownership in the company, and not even a controlling majority? That just doesn't seem enough to me," said Elizabeth. "It may seem that way, but I get a stake in the company that makes its first footfalls on the moon, and while it's not a controlling majority of shares, I will have an influence on how things proceed. Also, don't forget the more altruistic goals, like we will open up the rest of the solar system to the rest of humankind," said Michael. Elizabeth frowned slightly, but before she could say anything, Nathan said, "Well, that sounds like a very good deal to me." "Yes, and to me as well," said Elizabeth, the frown disappearing off her face. "That's fantastic, my young friends. I look forward to doing business with you and furthering humankind's progress into the solar system," said Michael. He reached across the table to shake their hands before turning off the anti-spying device and putting it back in his inside jacket pocket. He stood up and gave something between a nod and a bow to both of them and left the room. Elizabeth turned towards Nathan. "What do you think that was all about?" "Not here," said Nathan, putting a finger across his lips and pointing at the walls. Elizabeth nodded and they both stood up and walked out of the room. They were swallowed up into the crowd and made their way towards the other end of the hall, intending to do a circuit around one end to the other. Nathan pointed with his chin. "Isn't that the Mayor of London?" "Yes, I think it is him, but I'm not sure how much he could help us," said Elizabeth. "I can see some MPs that we could probably do with talking to here. If nothing else, we could do with gathering some political support," said Nathan. "Do you have any idea on what you might say to them?" said Elizabeth. "Not really. Maybe something like this," said Nathan in a slightly sarcastic tone. "We represent a company that wants to go back to the moon and open it up for humankind. We would achieve this by creating a permanent moon colony, which we would achieve by following several economic avenues in order to fund it. We intend on making this profitable for those willing to invest. We are wondering if we could count on your support in general, but also to get the Outer Space Treaty modified," said Nathan. He waved his glass in front of him as if to outline each of his points. "So that is what you would say, would you?" said an elderly-looking gentleman in a conservative black suit. Nathan seemed to jump with surprise. When he recovered, He was holding his hand over his chest and trying his best not to hyperventilate. Elizabeth raised her glass and was obviously trying to hold back a smile. Nathan shot her daggers just before returning his attention to the elderly gentleman who had just scared him half to death. "My young friend, you don't just walk up to someone, introduce yourself, and say this is what we want," said the jovial stranger. "You need to put some sort of flair into it, as well as maybe some charm or enticement of a sort anyway. It all depends on your approach and politics, really. Anyway, I'm Thomas Whitehall. I'm an MP. Yes, I see the irony of my name given where I work." "Sorry, my apologies, sir. I'm rather new to this," said Nathan. "But it is a pleasure to meet you." "What's this then about the Outer Space Treaty?" said Whitehall. "We are part of a venture that wants to open up space for humankind. In pursuing that goal, we may need to build permanent structures on most of the bodies in the solar system. We want to start with the moon." "At least once we've got the necessary infrastructure," said Nathan. "The current Outer Space Treaty doesn't absolutely prohibit us from doing what is needed as a corporation, but it could make things difficult for us in the future if it's not changed. My young friend, I believe that the Apollo missions were one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in my life, and I believe it's one of the most incredible things humankind itself has ever done," said Whitehall. "I also think that those bastards who blew up the spaceplane facility need to be dealt with." The mask of polite amusement slipped slightly on the jovial MP's face for a moment and showed a glimpse of something much darker. "My young friend, do you not believe our actions should be more focused on catching those bastards?" said Whitehall. "I don't believe they should stop us from achieving our goals, but I also don't believe they should get away with it. I just don't understand why we can follow both avenues of attack," said Nathan. "My young friend, the wheels of government move very slowly under most circumstances. Following both actions may take some time," said Whitehall. "Why is that?" "If you don't mind me asking," said Nathan, frowning slightly in irritation. He managed to hold back a grunt, if not a slight flinch, as Elizabeth discreetly elbowed him in the side. "One action involves the renegotiation of a treaty, and the other action involves money, time, and the investigative services," said Nathan. "Generally, you're right. But there also needs to be the political will behind whichever one they choose, and I think they're leaning more towards the investigative services. As at the moment, I think that is what the government will focus upon, but if anything changes, I'll be sure to keep you in mind. Saying that, transfer me your contact details and then I can get in touch if necessary," said Whitehall. Elizabeth pinched the screen of her smartwatch and gestured towards Thomas Whitehall's smartwatch. His watch beat in acceptance of the information. "Fantastic, thank you. I must leave you now. A politician's life is never relaxed," said Whitehall, shaking hands with them both, before then turning on his heel and marching away. Elizabeth and Nathan stood there for a moment in bemused shock, before then continuing their circuit around the hall. "What the hell was that all about?" said Elizabeth. "He didn't commit to anything and gave us the brush off in a polite way." "To be honest, it's more than I was actually expecting," said Nathan. "What do you mean?" said Elizabeth. "I mean, I expect to get the brush off by all of them. At least with him, we were able to give him your contact details," said Nathan. "Yes, but that was all we were able to do, and he was polite but dismissive," said Elizabeth. "Yes, and like I said, more than I expected. You and I both know that there are a majority of people that want humans in space, but there isn't the political will at the moment to do that," said Nathan. "At least there is the political will to get back at these bloody terrorists. And yes, I do agree with Whitehall's sentiment that they should be found and dealt with," said Elizabeth. "I agree, but I also don't think we should lose sight of the important thing of getting people back into space," said Nathan. "After all, that's why we're here. Look, over there is another MP, and another just beyond him. Do you think we should introduce ourselves?" "Let's. Shall we?" said Elizabeth. This time she dragged Nathan over towards the MP. The pair made their way round more than a dozen MPs and several industrialists. 2 hours or so later, the lights dimmed throughout the entire hall. Elizabeth and Nathan looked around, as did everyone else in the hall, before a spotlight was switched on, lighting up someone as they walked onto the stage at the other end of the hall. Someone came up behind Elizabeth and cleared their throat. She turned sharply, tensing up from the invasion of personal space. "Excuse me, miss, but are you Dr. Elizabeth Reacher?" said a young man standing behind her dressed as a waiter. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" said Elizabeth warily. "I have been sent to inform Dr. Reacher that she will be the third speaker," said the waiter. "Please follow me." Elizabeth and Nathan followed him, before he turned and said, "Sorry, sir. I was sent only to retrieve Dr. Reacher." "Wherever she goes, I go," said Nathan. "I'm sorry, sir, but only Dr. Reacher can go on the stage," said the waiter. "Okay, I'll go with her as far as that," said Nathan. "I think we can allow that, so if you follow me," said the waiter, walking off in the direction of the stage. The three of them made their way to the side of the stage but out of the beam of the spotlight. Elizabeth and Nathan looked out over the stage at the person who was still partly in the shadows, enough that they couldn't make out who it was. A moment later, 2 more spotlights came on, slowly focusing on the person standing on the stage. The person in the shadows was revealed to be the Prime Minister. "My friends, colleagues, and guests, we are here tonight to remember those people that have died in the recent bombings at the spaceplane facility," said the Prime Minister. "We're also here to raise money for several charities to help those that have suffered in those attacks and other charities that are involved in helping our world and its people." The crowd gathered in front of the stage and around Elizabeth and Nathan, clapping at the Prime Minister's introduction. "I ask that you do what you can to help those that need help," said the Prime Minister. "In the past few days, some truly terrible things have happened here in our nation, and truly awful things continue to happen across the world." So Elizabeth found herself nodding in agreement with what the Prime Minister was saying. "We will do what we can to hunt these people down and bring them to justice. While justice is a wonderful thing, we still need to do more, especially to help the victims, and that is something we can start right now, here tonight. All I ask of you is to listen to the other speakers that will be talking tonight and to do everything in your power to help their cause. I will now leave the stage and leave you to our first guest speaker this evening," said the Prime Minister, walking towards one side of the stage while gesturing behind to the other side. A young man in his mid-20s power walked to centre stage. "No, is that—" "No, it is," said Elizabeth, recognising him from being online. He was so full of energy that he seemed to bounce up and down even once he'd stopped moving. "Good evening, my friends. You know who I am. I am the Servaday man," belted out the online celebrity. "The most important thing to all of us, Mother Earth herself. You know, the 2 biggest things affecting her are deforestation and overpopulation. We don't just need to raise money, we need to find other alternatives to deforestation. We need to give the generations to come a chance of a sustainable future by reforestation, where for every tree we cut down, we plant 1 or more, preferably many, many, many more. We are good, but by no means perfect in this country at this. There are other countries across the world that scorn the idea," said the celebrity, dramatically pumping both fists into the air at the same time, "and are absolutely pitiful. All nations really aren't doing enough, or are even actively working against it. What's worse, overpopulation fuels this fire. We need to do more ourselves, but more than that, we need to put pressure on organisations to force them to do more. The people in this room have the power to bring political pressure to bear, as well as potentially economic pressure and even incentives. Between the politicians here and the heads of corporations that are with us tonight, it is you who can make a difference to the world, and I hope you do so. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope you take my words to heart." The celebrity bowed to the audience, holding the pose for a few moments before walking off the stage. Elizabeth turned to Nathan. "It's not that I disagree with his statement, that deforestation and overpopulation are problems. I just think it's going about it in entirely the wrong way. She shook her head, continuing, I know extremists can or look past the end of their nose at the big picture or even sometimes at other options. But that doesn't matter now. You do realise it's your turn on stage, said Nathan. Oh, said Elizabeth. What should I do? Just do what you think is right, said Nathan. That's a really big help, thanks, said Elizabeth sarcastically. Your turn, said Nathan with a cheeky grin, giving her an elaborate bow while gesturing towards the stage. Good luck. Thank you, said Elizabeth, turning from him and walking towards the stage. Her walk was stilted, as if she was walking towards her own execution. The palms of her hands were sweaty, and her stomach felt like it was trying to do some sort of weird combination between dropping through the floor and doing somersaults. She stepped up onto the podium and into the spotlights. The audience disappeared into indistinct shadows, with the bright light focused on her. She rested her arms on the podium and took a deep breath before saying, Thank you all for coming here tonight. Before I get into my presentation, I would like us to take a minute's silence in memory of those people that died at the spaceplane facility. She was wringing her hands again. Realizing what she was doing, she interlaced her fingers while bowing slightly. After the minute's silence was over, she stood up straight again and put both hands back flat on the podium. Back in the 60s, a certain president of the United States said, We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, said Elizabeth, before leaning forward towards the crowd, bracing herself on the palms of her hands on the top of the podium, and continuing, more loudly now. And they did. One of the most amazing endeavours humankind has ever achieved was the Apollo program, and we managed to put man on the moon several times in the 60s and 70s. However, we haven't been back again since. While it would still be hard due to advances in technology, it will be easier. The spaceplane in particular has made it easier and cheaper for us to have access to space. We have the technology, we have the ability, but do we have the will? Political will is one of the few things standing in our way to open up the solar system for all of humankind. The company I represent want to take the first steps back to the moon, and from there open up the rest of the solar system for humanity. Opening up space has so many advantages to us I can't even name them all, but just to go off some of the earlier speakers' examples, opening up space will allow us to release some of the pressure from overpopulation by allowing immigration to other worlds in the solar system. We would also become a multi-planetary species, which means that no single extinction-level event would be able to wipe us out as a species, preserving the human race. We would also have easier access to materials, such as contained in asteroids. Also, we would be able to move industry into Earth orbit, stopping us from polluting our home world. The advantages are many and numerous to us, and my company and I want to make it a reality. Thank you for coming tonight, and if you'd like to speak to me or my partner, we will be around for some time after. Elizabeth bowed slightly to the crowd and then turned and walked off the stage. As she left the spotlight's beam, she was able to see the crowd again, and she thought, did I really just speak in front of all those people? She also noticed a man towards the back of the room putting a rucksack on the floor. She had a quick look round the large hall and noticed several other people with rucksacks doing the same thing. She sped up her pace slightly, but not rushing too much to indicate that there was something wrong. She got back to Nathan and said, I think there's something wrong. There are several men with rucksacks. They've just put them on the floor and started to walk away from them. Oh shit. Come on, we need to warn security, said Nathan, walking to the nearest security personnel close by them, and the stage. Elizabeth walked up to one of the security guards. Excuse me, it may be nothing, but I've just seen several men leaving some rucksacks and walking away from them. It may be nothing, but it might be a good idea to check them just in case. I'm sure it's nothing and you don't need to worry. The security around this building is exemplary, said the security man. I'm sure it is. Given recent events and who is here, being overcautious is probably a good idea, though, said Elizabeth. A flash of annoyance crossed the man's face before the mask of professionalism came down again. "Okay, did you get a look at these men?" said the security guard. "I only got a glimpse of them, but they were all dressed in waiters' uniforms," said Elizabeth. "Like I said, I only got a glimpse of them as I was walking off the stage." The security guard raised his watch towards his face and spoke into it. "This is Alpha 7. Has anyone just seen several men leave behind some rucksacks? They may be dressed in waiters' uniforms." Elizabeth and Nathan didn't hear the reply, implying that the security guard was wearing an earpiece. "Roger, Bravo 3. Check out the rucksack and the rest of you keep your eyes on the targets," said the security guard into his watch. He was silent for about 15 seconds before saying quietly, "Oh, shit." It was then the bombs went off.